girl walking with her dog playing catch. So I guess I'll talk about my dad for a bit, since I'm on the subject. Hope I've got Alright. Where was I? Daddy. Yeah. Amazing guy. Don't have a lot of heroes in this world. But, you know, we don't really want to hero worship, but, you know, it's okay to, you know, it's understandable we're going to respect certain people and admire certain people. And admiration of one's father is natural. But he really was an amazing man. And I'd like to think I take after him in some ways. For me, if there were really two that influenced me, I think. And that was my father. Hello, echo, 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 echo. And my Uncle Al. Two amazing men. But let's get back to Dad for a sec. So he grew up in the Depression. And he was the baby, and he had an older sister, and then 3 older brothers. So he was the youngest. So he used to tell us all the stories and stuff growing up. And they were a very close-knit family. And the Burkes, they, wonderful people, intense in the sense that, you know, they just say what's on their mind. They don't really have an edit button at all. And so my family, of course, wasn't too far removed from that. And but his family, yeah, they just had no edit button. But their hearts were in the right place. They were very loving, caring people. And they were very close. And they had a rule, even though they didn't have an edit button. It's busy on the trail today. Even though they didn't have an edit button, they often got in heated arguments or debates. Nothing nasty, but, you know, just feelings would get hurt. They had a rule. It was just a unanimous rule. They all followed it, all of them. And that is, never go to bed angry and always apologize before you go to bed. Now my family, his children, we didn't quite have that rule. I have to say. I love my family, but still a lot of water under the bridge. Stagnating. Not water under the bridge in the sense where you let it just be water under the bridge, like the saying goes, but stagnating water that still stinks and comes up occasionally. But, you know, we've worked some stuff out over the years. People do their best. And we love each other, and that's the important thing. We're all growing in our own way. But yeah, his family always apologize. Don't go to bed angry. Anyways, I grew up in the Depression, and the mother was sick. I don't know what it was, some kind of abdominal issues. And the medical profession was, you know, a lot, you know, not as advanced as, if you consider it advanced. You know, we could get into that. I won't get into that subject. Well, this will be a 6-hour video, but, you know, compared to back then, you know, they know more. A lot of things they had no idea about back then, so they were shooting in the dark, and things that now are minor, you know, were life-threatening. And so whatever that was, some kind of abdominal thing, was considered life-threatening. She was in bed for months at a time, on and off for years at a time, and I don't believe they had free health care back then, so they all the kids, the brothers and that, had to quit high school, and they did it willingly. It's not like they were forced. They just all pitched in, so they quit high school. So my dad was an accomplished man and very intelligent man, but he never actually finished his high school. But yeah, they quit, got jobs. So they had multiple jobs. Came from a hard-working background, so they'd have 2, 3 jobs each sometimes. I think back then they were making, if you were lucky, 25 cents an hour. And so yeah, they all had to quit and pitch in just to take care of the mom and pay the bills, and they would come home and throw the money on the table, and the dad would, scoop most of it up for the family, and then slides a little bit here and there back to them and say, here, this is for you, for yourself. So they took care of each other, and a lot of laughter. And even though they weren't, they were poor pretty much most of their lives until they got in adulthood, then they all, found their way and found jobs and did okay. Nobody got rich, but they did all right in the end. But back then, very poor, and as was everybody in the Depression, pretty much. Well, except for the ones that caused it. But so yeah, they one thing they did do though, they made sure to find the money or find the means, is they did have a roast on, I don't know why I'm quoting roast, but a roast on Sundays, and sit as a family and enjoy it. And they were a religious family too, so they were Catholic, and they prayed a lot. But yeah, a lovely family, bunch of characters, and yeah, I don't know much to say about them more than that. Get back to my dad. So then, when he was a young lad, the World War II was concocted. Happened. Bankers. Anyways, again, I'll try not to get on side rants. So much one can rant about if they really want to. Anyways, World War II came up, and my dad and many others were told, made to believe, which there was some truth to it, don't get me wrong. This part was true. They found out that the Jews were being slaughtered, mass genocide, and so they pitched in and jumped in thinking they were doing the right thing, and their hearts were in the right place, and my dad did too. And so that was genuine. In the end, my dad, over the years, as most people in war would tell you, war solves nothing. But still, their heart was in the right place. They felt for those people, and so they pitched in, and you got to admire that. And they were those people, if you look at the Holocaust. Yeah, I know some people argue it didn't exist, all that kind of stuff, but, you look at the evidence. There's enough footage and evidence and experience and stories out there to say, come on. Now, the details, again, we could debate about how it was started and why it was started and what really caused it, and whether the banks were involved that funded Hitler and all that other stuff. You could go into that all day, but the fact is the Germans, Hitler, were slaughtering all those families, and that was real, and so people around the world pitched in, and my dad was one of them. So he was in the Navy, and better wrap up the dad part, because otherwise this will be an incredibly long video. So yeah, he was in the Navy. Didn't see any up close action, mostly just on the ship. They were mostly always out in the Atlantic and whatnot. You know, he experienced some amazing things and some horrific things. Saw ships go down and men, you know, ships on fire and people falling in the water. And, you know, the water was so cold, they knew as soon as they hit the water. So, you know, he saw some stuff and lost friends and etc. But saw a lot of the world. And I remember, and he told us some stories. He never told us the horrific stuff. All his stories were always upbeat. So no matter what it was, even if it was rough things in his life, you know, he never told you the horror stories, or he would just tell you the funny stuff that happened during those hard times, whether it be depression or war. So all my stories, that I remember, there's a ton of them from my dad, are all funny. And so, you know, he told us stories about that, about the war. Maybe I'll tell you a couple real quick. Let me think. Oh, they were, I don't know, I think this was Nova, geez, my memory's starting to slip. I actually recorded, one day I'd like to transcribe, either make a book or something with it, but last year's I realized I didn't, even though I knew his stories, but I didn't know so much of the details, you know, too much details to remember. So I started recording them, so one day I'll have to transcribe them. But so forgive me, the details will be vague and possibly wrong, but I think it was Nova Scotia they were docking during the war at one point. They went all over the place, docked all over the place, Ireland, England, you name it. But this story, they were pretty sure it was Nova Scotia, and I don't know where. I think it was the capital, because it keeps coming up that there was a capital, wherever it was, but I'm not sure. Anyways, wherever they were docked, and they went on leave, and he went off. You know, had his fun, like sailors do, you know, going to the pubs and getting mostly food, you know, fresh food, because they're out on the water for so long. You know, the food starts to dwindle down, and, you know, they're cutting mold off the bread and stuff like that. And my dad could never eat salmon, or tuna, sorry. He could never eat tuna, and the reason he couldn't eat tuna was because when they were deprived of food, what they would do is they would drop charges in the water, and all this tuna would come up dead. And then the cooks, which were, you know, these dirty old guys usually that just schlop food together, they would just boil the tuna into a mush and serve it to them like mush. You know, maybe add some salt and pepper. So my dad didn't like tuna. So when they were on leave, you know, they would have to get shots, because a lot of times they'd be running for the milk, especially if there were places where there was dairy. So they'd have to get shots first at the time. But so a lot of times they were, you know, my dad even got sick a few times, you know, that they'd come back on the ship and the doctor would go like, "You silly son of a bitch." I think one story I remember is because wherever they were was somewhere tropical, and my dad just ate way too many bananas. I mean, just like too many bananas for a human to digest, among other things, and he got sick. But anyway, so on leave, you know, some would be, you know, looking for the ladies, the stereotype of the sailors. And my dad wasn't like that, but to my knowledge, I mean. And some would go drinking, but my dad mostly, you know, would be just touring and discovering the country or the place he was in, and usually the food. So he was off doing that, and he came back one night, because they have to be back at a certain time, and 3 guys he knew from the ship, it's late at night, he's coming back, and they're already supposed to be on the ship, so this is like already a no-no. So, you know, occasionally you would get guys sneaking back late at night, but, you know, if you got caught, you end up in the brig. But Dad ran behind, so he was trying to quietly get back on the ship, but as he gets onto the ship on this port somewhere in Nova Scotia, And I guess there was a city hall building nearby that had a kind of a big tower to it or something. And my dad walks up, and there's 3 of his shipmates, and they're drunk, of course, just absolutely drunk. And actually one of them was wearing nothing but a trench coat. He was completely naked underneath, and he had shat himself, so he had shit all up and down his back and legs. What a pretty sight. But anyways, these 3 characters, totally drunk out of their minds, were loading shells into a cannon while everybody was sleeping on the ship. So my dad comes up, and they're loading this shell in, and one's directing them, and then they're aiming the cannon at City Hall. So these 3 drunk bastards are going to blow up City Hall. They were actually going to do it. My dad talked them down. So something that never made history that would have. My dad prevented that from being history. He really did. He talked these guys into just quietly going to bed because they were going to blow up City Hall. But yeah, wild stuff. What else? What other stories can I tell? What else? Okay, another story. When they would go on leave, they had a ceremony where a certain time they'd have to, they'd be informed that they have to put on their good uniforms and all pressed and cleaned and their boots polished. And then when the whistle or whatever the call came at the time, they'd have to be ready, and they'd all lined up. These ships were very, especially my dad's, it was an escort ship, so they're small ships that kind of rode along some of the other ships just to kind of protect them. But really, my dad's ship had minimal armament, so really it was just for show. But very cramped quarters, and narrow hallways, all metal. So because these things were metal, they were bolts you've probably seen in the old war movies or whatnot, or Red October. It was kind of like you see in the submarines, very narrow hallways and doorways, and bolts everywhere, especially on the floors, just bolts everywhere. And so whatever, I don't know what my dad was doing, but he forgot the time, and the call went out. He wasn't ready. And in the military, when you're supposed to be somewhere at a certain time, you got to be there at a certain time. And so the call goes out, and all the men on the ship are lined up in these hallways at attention in their uniforms, and these hallways winding all the way leading to the captain's office, I guess you could call it. And he was sitting in there in a desk, and the routine was they'd shout out a name of a sailor, and that sailor would snap to attention, and then march down the hall into the office, snap to attention, salute, and ask permission to leave the ship. And they would say, permission granted, and somebody would mark him on a piece of paper, salute again, and off he goes on leave wherever they are for a day or 2. So they're all doing that. One by one, they're being called, and they're all lined up. The whole ship's lined up in these hallways leading into this office. And my dad's name gets called, and he's still just trying to get his uniform all sloppy and stuff, and he hears, "Bark!" So he starts running, and he's really far away. So he's running, and he's trying to put his uniform together, and the call keeps going, "Bark! Bark!" So he finally, hears, the 3rd or 4th Burke, and he's pushing it, and he comes running down the final hallway up leading to the office past all these sailors, and he's running full tilt. And he goes running, and just as he gets to the office, because of all these bolts, because he was running and just out of his mind trying to get there, he tripped. He tripped on one of these bolts. And the momentum, he went flying into the office, slammed into the desk. The desk went over, the captain, who on a ship, that's God. The captain goes, the feet go up, totally back in his chair onto the ground, desk on top of the captain, and my dad slumped over the desk. So the captain's pinned by a desk and my dad. We're going to stop here for a sec. So yeah, so now the other officers, pick Dad up, and of course they're pretty pissed at him, and he snaps to attention, and now they're picking the desk off the captain, and picking the desk up, and putting his hat on, and the captain trying to, he's all not mussed up, and he's trying to get back in his chair. And my dad's like, "Permission to leave the ship, sir," all freaked out. And so then the captain just looks at him and goes, "Burke! Permission granted! Get off my ship!" So surprisingly, he let him go. But, great story. So I think I'll end it there for Dad, because I could go on all day about Dad stories. But yeah, funny man, lots of great stories. One of the most tender men I've ever met. He wanted nothing. He just lived for others. He literally wanted nothing. He had and maybe that's where I've always felt this push to be of service to others, because he never wanted anything. Really, nothing. Birthdays, he didn't care about the gifts. He didn't want the gifts. Christmas, he loved to give to others, but he didn't want anything. He had a family. He had the air in his lungs. He was good. Occasionally a nice meal, maybe a little bit of scotch. He liked to scotch, but, once in a while. But even that, there was nothing that important to him except his family. And so he always loved to sing. So whenever we were out, we were embarrassed as kids because he would sing in the restaurants, sing in the stores, Usually a few of the same songs would come up. My heart is a hobo. If he'd go into restaurants, when the waitress came up, or anywhere where there was a female, it didn't matter who she was, what age she was, what she looked like, he'd always greet females the same way. And he meant it. When they come up, he'd go, "Here she comes, Miss America." And a big smile would light up on her face. But yeah, he'd sing in restaurants. Kids, we'd dive under the table embarrassed. But he always had a song in his heart. And he was a happy-go-lucky guy. Even though he worked hard. He was on the road as a salesman growing up. He had 7 kids. And my parents found out that, or they were told, which was wrong, which a lot of people throughout history, women are told, you can't have kids, and it turns out, and they end up getting pregnant someday. That happens a lot, and that's where this is story going. My parents were told she can't have kids. So they adopted. So they adopted 4 babies. Like babies. Which is more rare today, but back then you could do that. So they adopted 4 babies. 2 of them were twins, a boy and a girl were twins. And they had them, and then just a couple years after adopting them, my mom got pregnant with my sister, Eileen. And so, yeah. Mosquito. And then, many years went by, and then when my mom was in her 40s, and then thought for sure that was it, and pretty much had it with kids at that point, loved her kids, but, Dad was always on the road, so she looked on, paying the bills and stuff, and he was a salesman on the road, so it was a lot of work, so, she was definitely done, and in her 40s, she finds out she's pregnant. She goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Eleanor, if I had a drink, I'd give it to you. You're having twins." And so, yeah, me and my twin brother were born. So go figure. So yeah, big family, 7 kids. Dad was always on the road. Came home weekends, when he was home, he was there, he was present. He'd play with us, he would bring us treats, he would sing to us, he'd spend time with us, he'd make us all breakfast, make Mum breakfast in bed, and make a roast on Sundays. And he'd make Mum and breakfast, I remember this. And they were big into big band music back then, it was called. And that was the style of music. And so they had lots of that around the house, and they had a stereo. And so, wow, the mosquitoes. I think I'm going to walk because there's a lot of mosquitoes around here. So in the mornings, when my dad was home on the weekends, of course he'd make my mother breakfast in bed. And but the way he'd bring it to us, he'd get all his kids, and when the breakfast was finished, he'd put on the big band music, blare it really loud. So this would be around 11 or 12. He didn't wake her up early. He let her sleep in, but then he'd make, the works, bacon and eggs and toast and jam and, grapefruit, big grapefruit, the whole works. And so my mom would wake up to big, loud band music, and then all his kids, he'd give us pots and pans, and we'd put it on our heads, and we'd start, and we'd have pans in our hands and pots in our heads, and we'd all march. First we'd march around the living room and the kitchen, because it was all kind of a big circle, banging the pots and stuff. And to the music, marching, bang, 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 and then we'd march up the stairs, and he'd be carrying the food, and we'd march into her room. Probably this time, she would already heard it, starting to be awake. And yeah, she'd get music and a show and breakfast in bed. So that was my dad, and that was how we grew up. So he was a character. And when he was a salesman on the roads, he got lots of stories. I won't get into those, but so he sold adhesives, basically the glue that binds the Coca-Cola cans, and I don't know if there's glue on that, I think there is, but anyways, like Kellogg's boxes and stuff like that. So those were a lot of his clients, and he, even though he didn't have any high school education, he became quite an expert in adhesives. And even when they had problems in the factories, with the adhesives, they'd call him sometimes, and he'd go in, and he'd have a kit set up with these industrial thermometers and all kinds of other tools and stuff, so he could, and he'd tell them where they're going wrong or what's going wrong and help them out. Got a lot of stories are popping in my head, but I don't want to use up this whole video telling stories about my dad. Well, I'd love to, but it'd be too long. Man, it's lovely here. Bruce Trail in Hamilton, waterfall capital of the world. So yeah, he was a very tender, loving man. Didn't want anything for himself. Just lived for his family, brothers. Christmas, I remember, he'd invite strangers over. He would, for Christmas. We grew up with big Christmases because we had a big family, and he had a big family before, they eventually got older, and all his brothers and sisters started to pass away, and now my family is pretty small, actually. But it used to be a massive family, and Christmases were actually just before I was born, the family was so big they'd actually have to have 2 Christmas dinners just to fit everybody in. But when I grew up, we'd have a big buffet-style Christmas Eve, and then Christmas Day we'd have, the immediate family, which was also very big, around the table with, some kind of roast. But Christmas Eve was more of a big celebration party, and it's just a buffet, help yourself, and lots of booze and food and music, and excuse me, laughs. And when he'd be out shopping for gifts and shopping for food and all that stuff, he'd just invite strangers, whatever, come on over to our house. So yeah, it was great. Growing up as a kid, you never knew the house would be packed on Christmas Eve, and the smell of food. And I never cared about the gifts. Some of the other brothers and sisters, like a lot of people, were all wrapped up with the gifts. I never cared. Maybe again, I got that from Dad. I never could care less about the gifts, well, except for Star Wars figures for a while there. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with those, but I never cared about the gifts. For me, Christmas, the best thing was the food. Plus, my mom was on a budget, and she grew up in the Depression, and she came from a family, they were penny pinchers. So, when Dad was home on the weekends, that's when the bacon and the butter and the good stuff came out, and holidays too, like that. But the rest of the time, if I grew up on, puffed wheat and powdered milk, which is probably why I ended up from a young age not really eating breakfast, But I'm still thankful. She still fed us and kept us, healthy, and because of that, we didn't get spoiled with all the garbage, the toxic sugared cereals, and all the other stuff that other kids, So really, it was awesome. It was perfect. I love the way I grew up. I'm not complaining. I complained back then, but I certainly, not complaining. But yeah, so for me it was, all this gorgeous food and cheese and butter and, all this great food and music and laughter and a house full of people and partying, right, a house full of loud people all the way till 3 or 4 in the morning. It was great. It was great. So, yeah, my dad loved life, and he didn't. He loved people, and he loved this world. And, he's somebody I think we could have. He didn't aspire to be, but if we had a leader like that in the world, we'd be in good hands. Although now I think it's time for leaders altogether, leaders and rules and governments and the system. It's time to move beyond all that. But if you're going to have leaders in the system, he would have been amazing. But he didn't really aspire to that. Yeah, an amazing man. And then my Uncle Al was another one. That my mother's brother. And I don't remember what disease he had, but his legs were essentially matchstick. I think leukemia, I'm not sure, but it's just my memory. Whatever he had it as a boy. And so he always had a cane, and his legs were like matchsticks. And so when the war came along too, my mother's brothers, my mother grew up with she was the princess, and she had they lived on a farm, and she had 4 older brothers, and so Uncle Al was one of her older brothers. And so when the war came along too, they all went in as well to the Navy, including the father actually. Her father actually, he was in World War I, and he didn't like his sons going off into this war alone. So believe it or not, my mom's dad, my grandfather, who I never met my grandfathers. I met my grandmothers, but not my but they died when I was young, my grandmothers. But I never met my grandfathers. They were passed away before I was born. But my mom's dad, he actually got fake ID and dyed his hair black so he could get in, just so he could keep an eye on his sons. So he actually, this old geezer, served in the Navy. Once he was in, it started to become obvious, but too late, right? So they just let it be. And I think he was in the Navy too. And so basically he was always just keeping tabs on his sons and arranging for them all to get together, when they had leaves, and just, even though they were on different shifts and different, even some, they weren't all in the Navy, but he always was making sure to keep them together and keep tabs on them, and do meetups wherever they could, and, during the war, be the dad out there, and that's what he was. Amazing. But anyway, so Uncle Al, because of his condition, they wouldn't let him in. And but it was really perfect, because he was such a loving and hardworking man. He stayed home and took care of the rest of the family and the women. and financial. Hey,
Hi, are we up now?
no, that, you want to be? And so yeah, so you know, he worked a lot of jobs and worked very hard. Even though he had the legs and the cane, he was a hard worker, you know, and healthy as an ox, except for that condition. And so he stayed and took care of the family, and financially, you know, did what he needed to do, and so that all worked out. But he was an amazing man. It's hard to pick who influenced me more, my dad or my Uncle Al. Probably my dad, but it's a close tie. Uncle Al was the most loving. He always had a smile. I never ever, and I spent a lot of time with him growing up actually. We'd visit Toronto, where both my mom and dad were born and grew up. Actually, that's where I was born, but we went to London, Ontario when I was a month old. So I lived my whole life in London. And but we'd often go visit all the relatives that were down in Toronto, and we'd stay, you know, weeks at a time with Uncle Al. Sometimes she'd just drop us off, and they'd go see other relatives, and so we spent a lot of time with Uncle Al. And never, ever, and it's not just us. I mean, you hear the stories, and even when my mom and dad would talk about him, Al never got angry at anybody. He didn't have. He was just an amazing man. He was just the most peaceful man, happy-go-lucky man. Always had a smile on his face, but it was a great smile because all his teeth, upper teeth, were gone at an early age, and so he only had one tooth. So he'd smile with that one tooth. And we used to winch because he didn't spoil himself at all. He didn't care about. He needed very little in life, and so. He actually, believe it or not, he was actually rich. He worked so hard he was rich, but didn't spend a nickel on himself. Wintertime, my dad would say, they'd go over, and they'd be dead of winter, you know, when everybody else had the heat on and stuff, and they'd go in and the heat would be off. He'd only turn it on just enough once in a while so the pipes wouldn't freeze. But they'd go in, and there would be my Uncle Al and his brother might be visiting or whatnot, and they'd be sitting around a little crappy old black and white TV, and with parkas on, you could see their breath watching TV. And all he ate every day, believe it or not, and he was so healthy. He was always out, and he would find old bicycles and stuff and put them together. And I guess you know, he could still do that with his legs, but he did bicycle, and he'd build bikes from garbage, and his clothes were from the garbage. He'd sew them together. And his food, all he lived on was he bought bags of this dried, crappy vegetable mixture, and he'd just boil into a mush, and he'd throw in fresh garlic and eat a bowl of that a day. That's it. And then tea or coffee. So he was a penny pincher too, but he was so generous. He was always giving his money away. And to his son, who unfortunately wasn't really a chip off the old block. It kind of drained him over the years of money, but he's always giving to others, and you know, that's what he saved all his money for, was others, not himself. But yeah, so he was a great, funny, always laughing, always smiling, never had an unkind word to say about anybody, never lost his cool, never. Doesn't matter what you could do to him. He was just he was totally at peace with life. I wish I could go back. You know, I wasn't old enough, but I would love to ask him some questions. I never did. I spent a lot of time with him, but I was just a little kid just enjoying being there. You know, he taught me how to ride a bike, and he would talk to us like we were adults, you know, he would talk down to us, and we just had a great time with him. But if I could go back, I would love to ask him some questions. But such a peaceful guy, loved everybody, quiet, very quiet. You know, didn't have a whole lot to say. If he did, you know, he said when he meant, but he never hurt anybody's feelings. Like I said, never a harsh word, never got angry. Even growing up, when he was younger, they said that, you know, if the boys got in trouble, you know, he apparently had a had a right cross that was unbelievable, that was just legendary. And he wouldn't get into fight stuff, but occasionally, you know, if his brothers were getting beaten up or something when they're young adults, you know, he'd usually find a way to passively break it up or whatnot. But if he had to, he'd jump in, but not with anger. And he would, you know, he'd never with the intention. But if he had to, you know, sock someone just to stop what was going on, he just made the one punch count. And apparently that's all it took. So, but again, not with anger, just, you know, just if he felt he had to. I don't believe in violence, so don't get me wrong, but I can understand where they're coming from. But yeah, an amazing guy, amazing man, just always a smile, only thought of others, needed nothing for himself. Like I said, lived like a hermit, lived like a bum, really. He had his own house, but I mean, lived like a bum, but he turned out to be rich. He was always rich, but he was just saving that for others. And eventually it all did go to other people, and mostly his son. And his son squandered it, but oh well. But, you know, he spread it out wherever he could, and but yeah, he was thrifty because, you know, he was saving all that money for others. And I remember one time my mom, we were visiting, she went to go pour some tea. So there's the water with the kettle, and she was going to go make coffee or tea, and she went to go pour the hot water into the cup, and a hot dog wiener came out. And I guess once in a blue moon he would spoil himself with, you know, maybe buy a pack of hot dogs. But this hot dog wiener goes into the cup. She's like, "Al, what's this?" And he goes, "Oh, I don't want to waste the water." But yeah, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man, both of them. So they were a big influence on me. That's why I keep scratching my nose, but there's pollen or something blowing around. It's making my nose itch. So, how long I've been talking? Geez, 42 minutes. Just been talking about my family. But I love my family. I was the youngest grown up, 7 kids. Me and my twin brother were the youngest. And, you know, I like the way we were brought up. Because my parents did come from the Depression, and because they went through Depression and the war, you know, they really valued family. And so, you know, I grew up sitting around where the family sat around, which is lost today, sitting around the dinner table every night telling stories, you know, "Remember the time you did this?" You know, and that's how I grew up. I would love to have that again one day, but that's okay. I'm not complaining. I'm good. I'm blessed beyond belief. But yeah, it was nice. So I had wonderful parents. My mother was a lovely woman. And, you know, not easy to take care of 7 kids on your own. And husband's away most of the time during the week. But, yeah, life. So many stories going on, eh? Everybody's got their own stories, their own families, so many dynamics. It's all so amazing. We're blessed. We're all blessed. I think I'm going to turn the camera off just for a little bit. Because if not, I think I'm just going to keep rambling about my family, and I think I should talk about some other stuff. So I'm going to turn the camera off for a little bit, clear my mind, and then see what comes up.